So I've been asked, what will be the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on higher education? I don't know. I do have some thoughts, which I'm happy to share, but as always, I think that time horizon matters, so I'm actually going to focus on the long term. My inbox is full of people who, of course, want advice in the short term. And I think that one of the best things to do if you have short-term questions is to refer to my podcast in which I interview the CDC. I interviewed a specific representative from the CDC who specializes in educational settings and study abroad programs. And that medical epidemiologist had a lot of good advice for colleges, including, for example, whether or not there should be a difference between rural colleges and urban colleges. Hint, no, there is not. And I think that podcast would be very useful for a lot of institutions. So in the long term, there's no question that millions upon millions will obviously be affected, mostly negatively. The pandemic will have effects on our society, financial, medical, quality of life issues for years to come, perhaps. And so I don't want to sugarcoat this. I don't want to make it sound as if, well, there's this great silver lining. But I do think that obviously we're all about students, and the effect on the students will actually be primarily negative. We already see this in the case of schools that moved to online, essentially all of them. We know that there are students who, for example, don't necessarily have the broadband access they would need to do a truly robust online instruction. We also know that students may not have the equipment support they need for their computer. And so I know that there will be students who essentially their education will fall by the wayside. We know that retention of online students is very low. It's lower than the already low retention of traditional students. And so there are students who simply will not have the self-directedness in an unstructured home environment with very little IT support and possibly an unreliable broadband connection. We know that is not a good environment for retaining college-age students. So I don't want to minimize the impact, but I do think there are two things that I will mention that I think in the long term, although there will be many things that will be terrible about this from a societal standpoint, terrible from an institutional standpoint, and certainly terrible from a student standpoint, I do think there are two things that will happen in the long term from which higher education as an industry will benefit. The first is that there's a migration online. It's occurring obviously in a very accelerated fashion, much more accelerated than anybody ever intended. But it's happening. And the fact is, for many schools, online was something of an afterthought, something that they sort of tacked on because they knew that that's what some students wanted. But it's very resource intensive, as I've mentioned before. It's very resource intensive to essentially maintain both a physical campus and a robust online campus. And so often it's the online campus that sort of ends up getting kind of short shrift. So I think that the fact that teachers will now, who may have only dabbled in online before, will now be forced to fully confront that medium. I think that they will benefit from that professionally. I think the school will benefit from having to finally confront the issue of fully supporting teachers who instruct in an online environment because the the support before may not have been adequate. And I think that it will be a truly long-term transformation for schools that had no online instruction before. It's important to remember that if you teach at a school that has a robust online platform, you may not even think about that there are schools who pride themselves on not having any online instruction. And when you think that those are the schools who, in about a 2-week period, are saying we're going to move to online instruction, if you think about what's involved there, you have dozens, perhaps in some cases hundreds of faculty who don't have experience doing that. You don't have an IT department who is used to supporting that. You don't have all of the infrastructure that you need. And so the idea that a school's going to do that if they've never done it before and have no experience doing it, that boggles the brain. But schools are going to be forced to make this transition. Some are going to do it very well. Some are going to struggle tremendously. But those who struggle will learn a great deal from that. And I think that in the long term, given that we will ultimately, as I've mentioned before, we'll ultimately see a very large-scale migration in higher education to online instruction, I think that all schools having more experience in that area, supporting their faculty, providing the instruction, schools benefit from that. The second long-term benefit is, for lack of a better expression, this provides a real-life financial stress test for schools. So during the Great Recession, banks were required to engage in artificial stress testing by their regulators. And this was very beneficial to banks. They basically would game out different scenarios in which there were different problems in the financial system, and they would sort of examine how those would affect their own bank. What's happening now, of course, is that it isn't artificial. We have a real problem, and this is going to affect the colleges. And what we're going to do is we're going to see exactly how it does. Because I think you'll see a real spectrum in terms of the school's ability to cope with this problem. Most schools have between 8% and 25% in cash reserves that is over and above their operating budgets. So in other words, most schools at any time, they have enough cash reserves on hand to pay for their operations if they had no revenue at all, for between 8% of their total expenditures for the year and 25%. Some have more, not that many. Some have less, not that many, thank God. And all the ones in the lower end of the spectrum will struggle mightily, because for all schools, this will represent a drop in revenue. How much of a drop? Nobody knows. And the reason why nobody knows is because nobody knows how this will influence students' willingness to go to college. Nobody knows how this will affect schools' ability to recruit students. And of course, we don't really know what will happen in terms of the current year, in sort of the midterm. What will happen to schools' expenses versus their revenue? So schools went to online, not only because, of course, they want their students to continue being educated, but because there's a tremendous consequence of stopping instruction. You're going to, presumably at that point, you're going to probably have to refund tuition, but you're also going to have to refund certain kinds of federal and state funding if you're not providing the education that funding was meant to pay for. And so schools continue to provide instruction, but at the same time, most schools are essentially closing now, at least their physical campuses, and this will dramatically influence their revenue. Many schools are not giving refunds, but some schools are. I noticed that the university that my daughter attends announced just yesterday that it would be giving refunds of everything except tuition. And, when I first heard that, I thought, that's interesting to me. I wonder exactly how they're going to do that from a financial standpoint, because most schools would not be in a position to do that. And so I think it is interesting to sort of think about what will be the effect of this. Now, of course, in some individual schools, the effect will be terrible. And I don't want to minimize that. But I think that in the long term, this will serve as a dramatic stress test for schools that will probably, it will result in some schools closing. But the schools that remain open will actually be in a better place than they were before. They will have survived the stress test. They will probably have put new processes in place to ensure that they're able, because now they're taking perhaps this circumstance more seriously, they'll put processes in place that leave them better able to withstand these stressors in the future. And so I think that the schools that survive, say, 3 to 5 years out, will actually be in a much better place financially. I certainly don't want to minimize this. I think that schools are in a bad place, students are in a bad place, the country is in a bad place. But as a country, we can rise above this. And higher education is always one of the leaders in the direction the country moves in. They are the thought leaders of the country. They are the research arm of the country. And higher education will be one of the strong partners in moving the country past this, through this. And so I actually feel that although in the short term and in the midterm, this will be a terrible time for students and for institutions and for the country, I feel in the long term that what we will see is that the country emerges, I think, stronger, because I think higher education, which is a cornerstone of the country, will emerge stronger.